the executive director for the Kansas City, Kansas Public Libraries. We are truly honored to have our guest speaker here this evening. But I want to just ask you, I think the team will be mute you all while we are talking, and then at the end, if there's time permitting, we'll open it up for some additional questions. But in the meantime, I would like for each of you just to note in the chat where you are watching us from. I know the last time we had people from Nigeria, we had people from South Africa, we had people from England, and I think it was from India as well. So it's exciting, and I want to welcome all of you this evening again to listen to our author speaking. If you know, I don't want to waste too much time, and people can just chat in as they come in. So welcome everybody, and it was so exciting this last few weeks that we've done the read aloud. Quite a few of you were on that and enjoyed it, and I enjoyed all the questions that you've sent via Laura. First of all, I want to thank Laura Lovelace, who's the manager for the main branch in Kansas City, Kansas. She was really the one that led us through the read aloud, and I want to thank her and her staff and everybody that volunteered to do the read aloud reading. It was fantastic, and I appreciate that. So without further ado, let me welcome our author, Qian Julie Wang, to our author event this evening. Welcome to Kansas City, Kansas Public Libraries. We're going to jump into all the questions. First of all, how did your parents react to the book? Okay, something's happening because I can't hear.
Off to a strong start. Thank you all for being here with me tonight. I want to especially thank Carol, Laura, and Sam for organizing this wonderful event. I'm looking through the chat, and it's amazing to see so many people from all over the country, all over the world. It really means a lot that you've chosen to spend your evening or morning or whatever it may be here. I did not tell my parents I was working on the book. I did not show my parents any portion of the book until it published, because whenever I thought about the idea of them reading it, I would get writer's block, freak out, because it's not just my story, it's theirs. And my father, for those who are intimately aware of contents of the book, know that his deep trauma is that early in his life, his brother wrote something that the government was not very fond of. And given the shame and the fear associated with being undocumented, the fact that we had hid that truth our whole lives, I feared that my writing this book would have triggered a lot of deep-seated trauma and pain for him. And so in many ways, I wanted to honor my own dreams and hopes while also protecting them and shielding them as much as possible. And it's funny because while I was counting down to the publication of the book, in my mind, I was also counting down to when ICE would come find us and deport us. And so I could have only imagined what would have gone on in my parents' mind, and especially my father's, had they known how very specific and detailed my book was. So I was very scared when I showed them. My mother instantly burst into tears when she saw the cover. I had wrapped the book for both of them, and she opened it, and the minute she saw the cover, she burst into tears. And my dad flipped to the last page and read the last sentence, which is something I do when I get a new book. I always read the last sentence first. And it just so happened for him that he read the last sentence of the acknowledgements. He hadn't flipped all the way to where the story actually ended. And lucky for me, the last sentence of the acknowledgement thanks my parents for giving me absolutely everything when they themselves had nothing. And so he read that out loud and he said, "This is a good book. I like this book very much." And so I think it probably disarmed his fears and nerves a little bit. He had been really afraid of not being able to find the strength to read it. He did ultimately read it. And when my parents finished, and when my book became a bestseller, which was all the more frightening for me because it kind of just told me, well, if ICE is going to come after us, they're going to come after us now. I spoke to my parents on the phone and they said, there's nothing we're afraid of now because we've reclaimed our lives and our identities and our truths from those shames and secrets that we had held our whole lives. And in the time that we've spent together since the book has come out, I feel like we've opened a new chapter, like we have license to live differently. We no longer dance around the things that we never talk about. And I think every family has those topics, right? There are things that you just never talk about, and it ends up weighing down almost all interactions. We don't have those anymore. And so we are free to interact differently and build a new dynamic and build new history. And it's been incredibly freeing as this year, 2022, has been really difficult. My father likely has 2 terminal illnesses. He's only 60. And so I'm just incredibly grateful that we got this time, however long, however short we have, to find new ways to engage with each other, to laugh and celebrate and revel in joy and not just in pain and fear. It's the greatest gift I could have received from readers, from the publishing world, from librarians, from everyone who has given me and my parents acceptance in their hearts and in their homes and in their libraries.
Why did you choose the name Qian when asked by your teacher? And a follow-up on the same question, it seems a time in your life when you wanted to feel connected to your new country.
I very much wanted to claim Julie at that time because I felt like Julie was legitimate. Julie was maybe somewhat white passing, if only on paper, without attachment to the last name. Julie was acceptable and American. But when he boiled it down to Qian or Julie and stared me in the face, I felt like a fraud claiming any name that I hadn't been born with, that I hadn't clutched in fear. And I didn't know what it meant to be Julie. I had only ever known Qian and all the inconvenience and trouble and otherness that she represented. And I think it would take me a long time to grow into Julie. I do think that it's important to have a piece of your identity and yourself that you choose to create and take on, but also have a piece of your identity and yourself that you inherit that is connected to your ancestors and connected to that wisdom that is deep in our blood. And so that's why these days I go by Qian Julie, because I want to honor both my ability to create this adult life and this adult self while respecting and honoring that ancestral wisdom that was bestowed upon me when I was born and that I continue to carry. And I think all of us as humans need both strands to live fulfilled lives.
Did you ever feel hopeless? How did you overcome that?
I felt hopeless then. There's still days I feel hopeless now. I think anyone who tells you they don't feel hopeless is lying to you. We're all gonna have days we wake up and just feel like the things we do are not accomplishing what we seek out. But certainly the darkest days of feeling hopeless for me are rooted in my childhood, of this sense of utter chaos and lack of control. I didn't understand what landed us in that situation. Before we arrived in America, I didn't even know documents existed, that there was such a document with my name and my birth date and place of birth, and that governed everything. But that was privilege, right? And without that privilege, my entire life, my entire reality changed. And I really wanted to go back to that place of ignorance and privilege, really. And I had no way. I had no way of knowing how. And for me, the hope, the faith came from libraries. And that's why I think it's fitting that this event is happening. I taught myself English on library books. I fell in love with these worlds. And while I would not know when I would see my family or my friends again in China, I had new worlds of friends and adoptive family in all of these books and the babysitters clubs and Sweet Valley High. And whenever I felt lonely, all I had to do was open a volume. And that was a version of home that I had never known before. And ironically, I think if we hadn't moved, if I hadn't known such deprivation, I probably would not have sought out books the way that I ended up doing. My father used to tell me, even when we were in China, that stories were power, and there was nothing more important than the story we tell ourselves, and there was nothing more important than the stories that societies tell themselves about how society is structured. And I didn't understand that or really think about it until I came here, and stories were all I had, right? Stories of why my parents and I were here, stories, lies about our status, stories about other little girls growing up in America, girls that I wanted to emulate and be friends with. And amongst those stories in the 90s, there were not many people who looked like me, who lived like we did. And I remember asking my mother as we walked down East Broadway in Chinatown, where there were only people who looked like us and lived like us, why we didn't exist in these books. And my mother told me then and repeatedly, even now, that I was someone who would put those stories out there for the world and help some other little girl out there or grown woman out there wondering the same question. And from there, I had a sense of purpose. And then from the stories of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall, I had another sense of purpose of affecting justice through the legal system. And it was really these incremental little steps of discovering stories of people I felt connected with and then wanting to build that connection outward, that libraries gifted me. It was truly a blessing. And without those books, I know that I would not be here where I am today.
What motivated you to record this memoir, and what do you hope readers will take from the reading?
Do you mean record as in literally?
As in writing? Yeah.
Writing.
I mean,
Okay.
your story.
Recording the audiobook.
No, I'm sorry.
Which I also did. Well, it was that, right? It was that inspiration from the library, that conversation with my mother that I would have over and over again. But it was also something else, because when I went to college and then law school, the practicalities of life quickly took over. The need to pay back loans, the need to pay rent, to make sure that I was never hungry again by stocking the fridge full of food, the need to give my parents money so that they felt financially stable. All of that took over, and I just quickly found myself lawyering day and night. Most of my 20s and early 30s were revolved around working 100-hour weeks and not doing much else. But then I became a citizen in 2016, 22 years after I first arrived here. And at my naturalization ceremony, it was in a courthouse where I had litigated many times before. The judge stood up in the front and pulled down this video screen, and a video of President Obama came on.
Wow.
And he opened the session with saying, "Greetings, fellow Americans."
Wow.
I don't remember anything else of what he said except that, because that unspooled me. I had to reckon with the fact that for all of my life, I had wanted to be American so very badly, and nobody would ever give me that title. And now the very first Black president of the United States was giving me that title. And what a distinct honor and privilege.
Mm.
And as I walked out of the courtroom, I paused at the door because I always, walked in and out of that courtroom as a lawyer. And so it was kind of a routine for me. And I paused and I said to myself, this is no ordinary day in court. And you have to remember this. Never forget what a privilege this is and never take it for granted. And that was in May 2016. The country quickly reeled into political discourse surrounding the November election for 2016. The language used toward immigrants, toward Mexican immigrants, Chinese immigrants, was horrific. It was a diatribe that I had never seen even in politics before. And I remember that feeling of privilege of thinking, for the first time, I mean, I hate hearing these words coming from the debate stage, but for the first time I feel safe. For the first time I know I can't be deported anymore. But what about the millions of people, millions of families and kids and struggling parents who are just working hard to pay for food and rent, who don't have that safety? What about them? And I remembered those days in the library where I wanted to find someone with my voice to tell me that I wasn't so alone. And that was really what kicked this book into gear for me. I started working on it. I started reading my old diary entries, looking at old photos, slyly fact-checking with my parents, asking them very pointed questions about our past, not revealing that I was working on a book. And yeah, the rest was history.
Could you share about how you and your family were able to access healthcare? What would be the one thing that could have made healthcare easier for you?
Oh God, I mean, we couldn't access healthcare. We had no assurance that if we went to the doctor, we wouldn't be asked to produce some form of identification, that we wouldn't be subject to deportation then and there. When I was getting my first vaccine for COVID, I remember showing up to the lobby and the person manning the desk said, "Can I see your identification?" And that awoke something in me because, of course, I did have to go to the doctor sometimes as a student to get shots. If I didn't have shots, I couldn't go to school. And every time I went, every time my dad took me, there was this fear of like, I have to brace myself. If they ask me something, I'm just going to run. If I can run fast enough, then they won't know who it was that showed up there and ran away, right? And all of a sudden I had this impulse to turn around and run. And then I was like, no, you've been a citizen for many years. You're good. But then I started thinking, well, what does this say to people who may not be citizens, who nevertheless need the shot and want the shot, and for whose neighbors and coworkers and friends it would behoove for everybody to get this shot, right? Not just people who are Americans, so-called. And that kind of assurance in the medical system, I think, has gotten better. But as example shows, it's not perfect. It's not anywhere near perfect. And so any sort of messaging to me and my family that we were safe, that there were certain realms of medical care that we could seek out, that we could step into without this fear. I think had that been the case, had there been posters, had there been signs on the subways, out on the streets, my mother's sickness probably would not have gotten nearly as bad as it did, because we would have sought help sooner and gotten preventative care rather than emergency care, which is probably the most taxing on both the patient and the entire healthcare system and society. And so if we're thinking about our society as one human body, right? What is the best treatment for that one human body is for all of us to feel connected in a community, feel safe reaching out to community to get that prevention before it becomes an actual ailment.
How do you feel your malnutrition as a child have affected your adult health, both physical and mental?
The effects on my mental health, I didn't even begin to process until I started working on this book. It was a lot to go back into that little body and feel that hunger and translate it onto the page. But when we moved to Canada, it was like overnight, all of our problems had been fixed. We didn't have to worry about documents. We could get benefits if we needed to. My mother immediately got a very well-paying job. And so very quickly, we were able to afford whatever I could think of wanting to eat. But my body was signaling to me that it was not that easy, even though my mind kept saying, no, it's fine, right? We're all better now. We have all these privileges and luxuries. We're good. All through middle school and high school, I could not eat a full meal without feeling like I had to throw up. It felt like I had bulimia, even though I never had bulimia. My body could not process a normal amount of food because it had been used to being hungry on such a regular basis. And so after lunch, I would just feel this constant compulsion to vomit. And my friends over time got used to it, like, oh, that's just what she does. She kind of like dry heaves over there, and we just give her space. And I never understood that because I think psychologically I had not healed enough or felt safe enough to understand it until I had enough distance. Even into adulthood, especially in college, when I was presented for the first time with dining halls where you could just grab whatever you wanted to eat, I had this impulse to just hoard all the food I could get. I could never turn down any free food. I would take it all if I was able to. And I would bring in containers and I would just take food that I had no hope of ever eating because no human could eat that much. But it was this fear of being hungry again. When I went to the supermarket, I couldn't just buy one apple. I couldn't just buy 2 apples. I had to buy 20 apples. Again, only to bring them home to have them brought on the counter. But it was this need when presented with the supply of food to stock up and to protect myself. And over the course of the pandemic, when things were running low, supplies were running low, there really were a lot of families in the world and in our country who went hungry, that I really started to confront this and think, why am I buying all this? I stand no risk of being hungry. My pantries are stocked. I will have more money tomorrow if I need to buy more. There are people who actually need this food. And so I began a practice of still buying that amount of food, but then donating it. And that something about that act made me feel a little bit more healed because it wasn't for me, but the younger me who is somehow still out there, unfortunately, in our world, still hungry and still struggling and living with fear. And so I hope that those actions can feed those undocumented children out there who are still facing some of the same traumas that I did. But this practice is, I call it a practice because it's continual. There'll be moments throughout the day where I catch myself and I tell myself, no, you're not in danger anymore. You are safe and you don't need to grip onto this with white knuckles. You can give this to someone else.
You give glimpses of generational trauma and how it has influenced the people in beautiful country. How did the experiences of Baba's family contribute to his decision to leave China?
I mean, I think it was everything. He grew up hating the Chinese government. And for him, America was the golden land. He would, after his brother was thrown into prison, he would crawl out of bed in the middle of the night and go into the floorboards where his brother had hidden all these banned books that he loved, from Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Mark Twain. And my dad, holding candle, would just slowly read each word I think he must have had a dictionary because he was teaching himself the words as he went. And in his darkest moments where he missed his big brother so much, he felt connected to him. The ideas that inspired his brother to do what he did, the ideas that motivated his brother, and the ideas that allowed him to feel closer to his brother's thinking and what he wanted out of this world. And so for all of those years, America represented this gold standard of freedom of speech and liberty and democracy. And China was the antithesis of that. Obviously, that's pretty black and white, and America doesn't necessarily live up to those ideals as much as we would like it to at all times. But from there on, there was no other life for my father. He was just too angry. And no matter how successful he got, if he got in front of a classroom, if he got in front of a lecture hall, he would start talking about the histories, the parts of history that China did not want him to talk about, did not want him to teach. And every country has some of those restrictive tendencies, those censorship tendencies, and China's particularly bad at it. So, after the first few times of him doing that, it became very clear that it would not be a good idea for him to stay there. It would not be a place where I could fathomably have a free future, especially the way that he taught me to think about the world at home. And from there, it was kind of written that he would do whatever it took to leave and to make it to his idea of the promised land, which was America.
Baba's decision to leave his homeland and family for something better is a familiar one for many immigrants. What did you and your family expect when Baba made this decision?
I was very upset. I didn't understand at all at 5 when he left why I would want to give up all this candy and food and dolls and toys and loved ones. And I guess as with any child, I was not used to change and I did not want that. But he left, and for 2 years I didn't see him. And for 2 years for a 7-year-old is a long time. I started to forget what he looked like, even though I had photos. I would watch TV shows with emperors in them and pretend that he was them, because I was just the facets of his face was starting to fade in my memory. And I missed him so dearly that I began to consider, well, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to give up my dolls and candy. Maybe there's better candy out there. And so when my mom made that decision to follow him, I was less angry and a little bit more curious based on what my father was telling us about America, based on, talking to other people about America. 'Cause back then in China, there was very limited information. So we were told to either expect hell or something like it, the worst, or people were starving and fighting for food and shooting each other on the street, or heaven, streets paved with gold, free food everywhere, people dancing and singing together in unity. And as I'm even describing it now, I'm thinking of particular scenes from my life in New York that represent both. And when we landed, I could very quickly see that it was neither nor, it was a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Bright lights and skyscrapers and bridges outside the taxi that my dad saved up to pick us from the airport. But my dad also looked incredibly hungry. His shirt was torn and old, and our apartment was one room where we shared the kitchen and bathroom with other families, and there were cockroaches everywhere. It would take me a long time to understand the structures and the barriers that undergirded this division of the two Americas, which I believe firmly exists across. But yeah, it took me a long time to reconcile that and to walk past restaurants filled with food and walk past stores filled with toys. And as a child, realize that none of that was for you. was a relegation that nobody, I guess, can be prepared to expect. And there was a way in which it made me believe that I was inferior, that I was of a lower caste, that I was subhuman. And that feeling, I think, is remains, perhaps will remain in small part forever deep down inside me, no matter how much I heal and nurture that inner child.
Why did you leave Canada and come back to the US when your experience there, when your experience here was so bad?
I know it's hard to understand, but somewhere along the way in those years covered in beautiful country, I came to love New York and America. I came to see myself as a New Yorker and as American. And most of all, I wanted to prove my father's American dream to be real. I wanted to live it out for him so that his sacrifices wouldn't be for nothing. And when we went to Canada, there was that moment of, oh, all our problems are gone. But then there came that secondary emotion of anger, right? Anger is inherently comes from pain and sadness, but I wasn't ready to go there yet because that requires vulnerability. I was just angry. I was angry that we had been kicked out. I was angry that my dad had been proven wrong, that everything that I had hoped to do to prove for him would not happen. And so from pretty much that moment on, I decided to fight my way back and to prove it right. And I think it probably comes from having spent 5 years surviving, right? Fighting against something, resisting some form of structural barrier. And once that was gone, I was confused. I needed something to resist. I needed something to fight, because if I didn't do that, then all I had was the pain and the sadness and this inability to process food and this fear of being hungry or poor again. So it became a survival mechanism for me. So I fought my way back to a fancy college and then a fancier law school, and just every step of the way thinking, one day I'm going to earn myself out of this lower caste status, this subhuman status. One day I'm going to prove that I am just as good, I'm just as American, I am just as acceptable as everyone else in these very white spaces the further up I got. And it's true what they say, be careful of getting what you want, because the higher I got, the more I realized I was not going to earn my way out of my skin. I was not going to earn my way out of my immigrant past. It was just not going to happen. And so I had to rewrite that American dream that my father had written out based on what he read and what he imagined growing up, and understand that there were things within my control and things outside of my control. And to love America is to see it clearly, meet it where it is, but also challenge it to be better. And so I love Canada. I'm grateful to Canada, but I'm first and foremost American. I'm first and foremost a New Yorker. And as much as some days it sucks to live in this country and as expensive as it is in New York, this is my home, and I'm here to push it to be better.
You experienced the first years of your life in America through the lens of your parents' fear of authority figures, fear of the dark, fear of other Chinese people. Can you talk about how that fear affected you? And can you also tell us about your experience of immigrants working undocumented in this country and how children are impacted by that?
When I think about, well, first of all, I want to say thank you all for these questions. They're not only profound, they are also shockingly poetic. So whoever's writing these questions, you should consider writing yourself, because they're beautiful. But when I think of the fear that immigrants face and the fear that I faced and my parents and I felt during those years, the scene of the cockroaches in the kitchen comes back to me. For those who didn't write the book and therefore probably don't remember every single passage, it was when I first moved here and was in this communal kitchen that we all shared. And at night, I would turn off the light switch and hear all the cockroaches pitter pattering on the walls coming out. And then all of a sudden, I would flip the light on, and then they would all scamper. That's the best way I can think of relaying what it felt like for us to be undocumented. We were so afraid of anything approaching being seen, being in the light. I remember seeing a sanitation worker in the subway station and just turning and running the other way. Anyone who wore a uniform to me was an authority figure who could get me deported, and therefore we just had to evade them. And this fear, this avoidance of detection governed our lives. It kept us small because there was no way that we would ever risk applying for a well-paying job, because it necessarily required documents and people who examined your documents. And this fear of, being seen is something that is also deep in the Asian American community. We all come from many of us come from a lot of generational trauma that have been passed down through both epigenetics and the way we were raised. And this idea of keeping your head down, not rocking the boat, is a deep current in many of our households. And so rewiring myself to operate otherwise was incredibly difficult. But I remember at one point in my very long therapy journey, when I thought, this fear is the thing that has governed me. It has been my boss for all of my life. And for once, I want to be able to be its boss, right? And maybe not its boss. I can be its friend, because fear can be helpful. It can keep you safe when it's in the right place, but it should not run your life. It should not keep you small. It should not keep you from taking risks and believing that you can take on that big job or that big project of being seen by your superiors, by the world, by your parents. And I began taking very little risks in time, like, taking a dance class I always wanted to take, but being afraid of being embarrassed or seen, and moving up in scale until I somehow found the ignorant courage to write this book and put it out in the world. But what does that darkness protect? What does that darkness uphold? Well, I think we know the very famous quote that darkness upholds oppression. It upholds white supremacy. It upholds the system. Because so long as we were taught and trained to hide, we could be exploited.
Mm-hmm.
We could, be paid cents on the dollar, because who was going to stand up for our rights? And it is the duty of the privileged few of us, the immigrants, the undocumented immigrants, the Asian Americans who make it out on the other side. Me, for example, with all of my privileges, to be as loud as we possibly can, because that is the way we pierce the darkness. That is the way we pierce the system. And that is the way we start to dismantle white supremacy.
One of the lasting takeaways from this book is your description of being hungry. I will never look at a hungry child the same way again, or how important free meals are. At an early age, you became whatever your mama needed: therapist, sounding board, and confidant. The roles of mother and daughter are switched on many occasions. How did this affect your relationship?
I think that switch happens very commonly in immigrant families, because the child is able to pick up the language a little bit faster, is able to engage in the mores of the new country much deeply and more quickly. And the parent is a little bit more steeped in the old culture of the homeland. So I think many immigrant children can probably relate to this, as well as children who had parents who were struggling with illness or addiction or any myriad of things. But those of us who've lived it know, once you flip that switch, once the mother-daughter or the parent-child dynamic is inverted, it's very hard to undo. I would argue that it's probably impossible to undo because the psychology of the child, the perspective of the child is forever changed. Before we got onto that plane, my mother was God. Whenever she was around, everything was covered and I didn't need to worry about a single thing. But the minute we got on that plane and she became sicker than anyone I had seen in my life, she could not communicate. She could barely lift her head up. I realized that my mother was no longer God. She wasn't indomitable. She was human. She shrank down to human size, just like me. And so then I very quickly realized as the day passed in America and I learned English faster and I understood things about some things about the world a little bit better, that there were things I could do, in fact, to protect her. Not to say that I was now God, but that we were on equal footing. And that can be very disorienting to a child. It changes your entire worldview. And it would not be until later when I had processed a lot of my past that I realized that it was this need, right, for us to go back to that relationship that was where my mother was taking care of everything and I was safe and she wasn't stressed out. It was that undergirding need that made me want to take care of things for her. Like maybe if I made her feel safe enough, if I saved us enough money, if I lied about, not needing meals at home because I would get these imagined meals at school, then maybe that she would regain control, regain health, mental and physical, and become that person again who would take care of everything. Of course, that was a subconscious dream and hope, and was never to be anyway, given the circumstances of the world we faced. But yeah, once that flipped, it flipped forever. And I remember being in college and law school and setting aside an hour each day on top of working 3 or 4 or 5 part-time jobs and a full course load. I set aside an hour each day to call my mother, to make sure she was okay, to be her therapist, to mail her something if she needed it, to send her money if she needed it. And that really wise judge that I talk about in the book, I remember one day she paused and she said, "How old is your mother?" And I was like, "What?" And she says, "The way you talk about her, it sounds like she's 95 years old and really weak and ailing." And at that time, my mother was in her early 50s, very healthy. And it got me thinking why I had this need to make sure she was okay and why I constantly had this fear that my mother was dying and ailing and hiding things from me, and why I had to be the one to take care of everything. And as with many things that wise judge told me, it sparked weeks of meditation where I started to distance myself a little bit and think, well, my mother is actually a grown adult, as am I at this point, but I am not necessarily responsible for her. And that mental shift turned my world upside down, that I wasn't responsible for, that I couldn't control her life, and that no matter how much I tried to control her life for mine, it would never go back to that childhood dream of feeling protected and feeling safe in quite the same way.
Have you ever spoken to your parents about McDonald's and the entry of James into your life?
Yeah, I mean, we joke about it, but a lot of people have asked me on my book tours what I think it was that had my parents rely on James, expose me to James, especially with my mother being such a self-respecting and dignified woman, which she was and continues to be. And I've done a lot of thinking about that. And I think on some level, my parents knew how hungry I was. On some level, they saw the longing in my eyes when I saw other kids with toys and Happy Meals and food. And when you're desperate, you can be blind to certain elements. You can be blind to certain risks and what you're exposing your child to because you so want to meet their basic needs. And I think that that is what happened with them, because on a certain level, they still have not really opened their eyes to what James was.
Mhm.
The facts of how he acted, of how he almost preyed on all of us, because recognizing that would be a further debasement to their dignity and their
Mhm.
sense of self. So we make it a joke and we act like it was no big deal, but it was a big
It
deal.
was a big deal.
Yes, and such a big deal that we can't really ever talk truthfully about it.
How did you feel about your mama telling you she almost jumped in front of the train?
At the time, terrified. At the time, thinking, what did I do wrong? What is it that I can do to keep her from going there? Thinking, oh, I was a second away from losing my mother, the one person that I am supposed to protect and keep safe. Looking back on it now as a 35-year-old woman, I don't have children yet, but I think about how much pain and how much desperation she must have been in to say that to her child. I think about what it would take me to not just get to that point of thinking about jumping, but then going home and telling my child that. And it makes me find new insight into what it was that she was going through. I don't think that I will ever fully know all of the details of what she faced, just because she would not share it all with me. Possibly she's repressed some of it from her own memory and her own accounting of things. But it just makes me think of all the pain that she was under, and the ways in which no human is equipped to deal with those circumstances, both physical and mental and psychological and emotional. Writing this book was incredibly healing for me, not just because of my own memories and my own experiences, but because to write it, I had to simultaneously hold many versions of my parents in my hands, the adults that they were at the time, the adults that they were in China and all the dreams they had, the desperation and devastation they feel here. Ooh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm trying to turn it off
It's
and
okay. Don't worry. Take
second.
no big deal.
Okay.
Okay, Mama's illness and your physical reaction to your own worries highlight the dangers of healthcare for the undocumented. Discuss all the obstacles to healthcare, the absence of it, the danger in seeking it out, and the danger in using black market healthcare, etc.
I was just going to finish my other thought. Sorry.
Sorry. No, that's fine.
Sorry, that really threw me off. Yeah, so hold these cells in the same time and see them as my equals, see them as I saw them as a 7-year-old, as a 10-year-old, as a 12-year-old, but also understand them with more acuity now as someone who's older than what they were at that age. And it's helped me gain a lot of appreciation and insight into everything that they went through and the choices that they made as parents, and the choices that they probably just did not have the capacity to even confront and make back then. So,
Yeah.
And your next question was what the undocumented face in Black market.
And all the obstacles to healthcare, the absence of it, the danger in seeking it out, and the danger in using black market health, etc.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, those doctors who were also undocumented and had no equipment That's a really horrible place to be for patients and for the doctor, because you're trying to offer treatment to people who desperately need it without any of the equipment that you need, without the lab access and the testing. And of course, as a patient, you don't have access to anything better. So you can only hope that these over-the-counter medications or black market medications is exactly what you need.
Right.
But that's the case with pushing any community of people outside the law, right? You end up forcing them into these worlds that are not regulated, where you have to accept less than standard care, less than standard medication. And it ends up, as I alluded to earlier, making the toll on our society even bigger, because if you look at purely from a numbers perspective at the medical system, you would much rather someone get preventative care 5 years before than end up in the emergency room, end up needing surgery, end up needing the ICU 5 years later, when this person is indigent and has no hope of paying back for that level of care. And so the way that we govern, the way that we illegalize humanity, communities, health, is deeply problematic, not just from a human level for those who care about the undocumented people and the undocumented Americans, but also just from a purely financial, practical, common sense level.
I've got so many more, and I'm trying to figure out which one is more important than the other one. On page 235, he asked fewer and fewer questions in America. Somehow, by leaving China, Baba had grown more Chinese, starting to adopt our government's silly ideas about how asking questions was bad and disrespectful. He took on the form of what America expected of us: docile, meek. Is this what America expects of immigrants?
I think so. I think that America would rather immigrants come and take on the jobs that no one else wants and say, thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to exist, to be alive, and just be grateful without any demands. It expects us, as many undocumented Americans do, to pay taxes without expecting any benefits in return, while allowing the news and the politicians to say we don't pay any taxes at all and we feed off the system. I mean, there are times now when I go out on stage or I'm interviewed when people comment and say, you should just be grateful. And I don't know what it is about me saying that I believe America can be better, suggests that I'm not grateful. I can love this country, I can be grateful for this country, but also say that it can be better and it should be better, not just for immigrants, for all of us. Because what happens to our neighbors necessarily affects us. And this approach to not just immigrants, but people of color, right? That we have to just thank and apologize for our existence and not make any demands, is once again, it's baked into white supremacy. And white supremacy is built into every facet of the immigration system. We decided early on what colors of people were legal and what colors of people were not legal, what colors of people were acceptable and what was not. And that has very clearly come down racial lines. And my whole life thus far has been unprogramming myself from this need to thank and apologize and be grateful, and to tell myself that I and you and everyone in this room, we have standing to speak up and say, we love this country, it's our country, but we know it can do better.
How did Julie come to be accepted? What was the process of adopting that name?
I don't know if accepted is a strong word. When I moved to Canada, I wanted so badly to divorce myself from that early experience of feeling subhuman. that I was like, I'm going to take on Julie because of everything it represented from the puzzle place of belonging and acceptance, and build a whole new life for myself. And for a while, Julie was like a cloak, like an invisibility cloak where I could just fit in. But over time, as I myself grew, as I processed, why I couldn't eat a full meal without feeling like I had to throw up, why I felt this urge to fight everything, why I had all of this anger and where that anger was coming from. As I processed all of that, Julie's story became that she was the adult self, that adult counterpart who parented that inner child, Qian, little Qian, Qian Qian. And Julie became the person who stood up in the courtroom and was not afraid of being seen by the light, and who could give voice in not just little Chen Chen's story, but the stories of other children and immigrant children and children of color who are out there. And so I think Julie went from being a force of brute assimilation, of a painful erasure of myself, to an actualized version of the adult that I once dreamed of being. And I'm not saying I'm done. And that's why I have actually fairly recently, upon the publication of this book, adopted Qian Julie, because true actualization is not erasing one or the other, but integrating all that we are and being all that we are. And that continues to be a journey for me, that accepting the anger and the sadness and the pain, but also knowing that we can make something joyful and strong out of it.
What will that little girl that has been finally taken by the hand say to present you now?
Well, I would hope that she say, I'm proud of you and thank you. But I think what she would actually say is, what the hell took you so long? Because, I mean, if you look at my life, I've actually been extremely lucky, and I was not undocumented for that long. There are people who've been undocumented for most of their lives, for decades, and have no hope of finding a way out. And I really wasn't that long for me. And yet I was so angry, and I was so lost in this need to erase myself and to bury that little girl. So I think she's probably a little pissed at me that I buried her for her wisdom. And she's right. And there are a lot of days now when I pause and I think, what would that little girl do? And it just instantly solves the dilemma for me. So I'm grateful to have found that voice and to have excavated it. And I hope that everyone here is able to tap into that wisdom as well. It's the most powerful thing we have.
This is a brutally honest and sincere book. And I'm telling you, people coming, week after week, mention how certain aspects or paragraphs or, whatever made them sob. You are truly inspirational to all of us, and especially a young Asian immigrant who aspires to step into the legal field. So the next question is, when is your next book going to come out?
I wish I knew. I think that when that next book comes out, that little girl's gonna say to me again, what took you so long? I'm working on it now. I actually wrote a contemporary novel last winter, but didn't feel like it was quite the story I wanted to tell, at least not yet. And now I'm working on a historical novel, and it's been incredibly fascinating, but also terrifying. So it's set during the Chinese Exclusion Act era in Chinatown, New York, and traces the evolution of the Chinatown gangs under the oppression of the Exclusion Act, and the women who were trafficked to the brothels across the country, including New York City. So my idea is that one of the gang members will fall in love with one of the women in the brothels, and they try to break out of this world, but against a lot of social and societal pressures. It was really difficult for me to fall in love with this idea because I did not pay attention in history class. So I would close my eyes and think, okay, so they walk out of this building and what did they see? And I have no idea, right? Short of knowing that it's not iPhones and iPads, I'm just at a blank. And so I've been researching day and night to get immersed in this era. It's 1890s, and understand what New York looks like and understand how people are talking at the time. And it has been the most edifying project and experience of my life, but I am not fully convinced that I can ever finish writing it. So the short answer is it will take me a while before the next book comes out, but I hope that it'll be worth it because I want to make it good and worthwhile. And I want to honor the stories that our history books don't tell nearly enough.
I don't want to take advantage of you, but there's one question that I think, can I just circle back and just ask you that one? It's this exploration of how much influence teachers have over students' emotional health is powerful, especially poor students. Mr. Qian is infuriating in his treatment of you. Did his treatment of you add to your belief in the bad luck you brought your family? Did it contribute to your willingness to apply to the gifted school? And have you heard from him since your book was published?
No, I have not heard from him. I've gotten many supportive and loving letters from readers along those lines of "I hate Mr. Qian" and how thank you all for support and solidarity. I do think that it fed into my bad luck, my sense of bad luck. I think that there are times now, even as an adult, where I think, oh, I just have bad luck, when really it's some form of racism or sexism or exclusion that's at work. And I would rather say it's luck because that seems more temporary than the systems that we're born into. Unfortunately, that was not the last time that such an occurrence happened. In middle school and high school, I had white teachers accuse me of plagiarism because there was no way I could write so well. When I had been a lawyer for many years, I had one of my supervisors accuse me of plagiarizing a brief. This ridiculous accusation, because one, he had heard me develop this strategy and argue it in court and talk to our clients about it. But two, there's no way you can plagiarize a brief because it's based on a lot of privileged information and specific information about your clients. But it got to a point after that where I had to just accept, like I said, right? I can't out earn or outwork my skin. I don't need permission for Mr. Qian or from anyone else to write well or to be myself. For a long time, I wondered, what was it about the outside of me that didn't match the inside? And I wanted them to match so that I could go to people and show them that I was really me. Mm-hmm. After that experience with my legal supervisor, having been lawyering for 6 years at the time, I thought, you know what? I don't need you to recognize me. I am me, and that's it. End of sentence. And I'm sick of waiting for permission. That's never going to come. I'm going to give myself permission from here on out and throw that out the window. I think it's also worth saying, though, that as a teacher in an underprivileged community, you have a great deal of positive power as well. I have heard from Miss Pong, whose real name is Miss Poon. She held on to every single inane card and letter I gave to her over all of these decades. She scanned them to me, and I said, what could possess you to hold on to this ridiculous assortment of words and images? And she said, I knew there was something special in you, and I wanted you to feel that from me.
Wonderful.
And I saw Charlotte's Web. So yeah, there and the librarians. I mean, special shout out to all the librarians here and to this Kansas City Public Library for changing lives every single day. You give access to stories and knowledge to people who need it the most, and you are changing lives every single day, whether people come back to you to tell it or not. As a former patron and person who would not be here without her public library, I thank you all for the work that you do. It's under-acknowledged, it's underappreciated, but it is the heroic work that our society needs.
I think you need to wrap one of those books up with a little note for Mr. Kane, you know, and just send it to him with good regard. It is.
I heard once someone tell me living well is the best revenge. So I barely think about him anymore.
No, and I'm not, yeah, I'm just saying. Oh, Qian Julie Wang, it was really a pleasure to have you this evening. And I'm not sure if you can see everybody's faces, but I wish that everybody can just wave and just say thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Kansas City, Kansas Public Library will be a place for your next book as well. You know, we have so many copies, so many people are on hold for your book. So we would like to invite you back the next time. Thank you so much for everything and for enriching.